Greetings for the day to everyone. A special welcome to our keynote speaker, Professor Till Tilolika, our dignitaries, senior academicians, and to all the participants. I welcome you to the second day of this faculty development workshop. As we know that, in this new norm wherein we are having all these discussions on the online platform, the protocols are to be followed very seriously. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult to conduct this session. So I am once again reading out the protocols that we expect our participants to follow. I request you all to keep your mic on mute and the video on switch off mode. In case you get disconnected, the same link that has been mailed to you can be used to re-enter. You can pin the screen of the speaker when the slides are being shown so that it will give you a clearer view of the presentation. Also, very importantly, the queries can be put only through the chat box and you can put them throughout the session. As yesterday, our speaker was answering your queries from time to time. We will follow the same thing today as well. Also, today, towards the end of the session, a feedback form will be administered. Through the chat box, a link will be sent. You are requested to fill that feedback form very carefully and before leaving this meeting, because on the basis of that form only your e-certificates will be issued. Once the session is over, within half an hour, after half an hour, we will not be accepting any more responses on the feedback form. So please make sure you fill it before leaving the session. And now we move on to the session formally. So in yesterday's session, our speaker, Professor Till, covered a variety of topics, which included the identification of adequate research subject, how to develop a promising research question, making a theoretical contribution, how you can make it meaningful, what is a theory and what is not a theory, both the things were covered, how we have to balance the rigor and relevance, and also he gave a few tips on writing the paper. We will be continuing today with the session, and today it will be mainly devoted to selection of an appropriate journal outlet, the review process of these high impact journals, and what is the role of editors and reviewers, what is the criteria that they use to evaluate the quality of the manuscripts, and very importantly, that as authors, how should we deal with the feedback that we receive from the reviewers for our research papers. Also, sir will be answering all your queries. You can keep them, you can keep posting them in the chat box. And we look forward to a very fruitful discussion today as well. And on this note, I hand over the platform to Professor Till. Over to you, sir.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Needy, for this kind introduction and also for the very apt summary of our session yesterday. Once again, a very good afternoon to all the participants. I'm very happy that you also joined the second day of our workshop, even on a Sunday. And as we were discussing before we formally started the session, if there are any questions from yesterday's session, we can deal with them right here at the beginning of our second day. There was a question by Dr.
Dr. Deepti Singh, that was one question which was there.
Yes, and he asked about how the rigor is evaluated, particularly in conceptual papers. And I already responded in the chat that the evaluation and evaluation criteria in the review process actually are one of the main subjects we deal with in our session today on the second day of the workshop. So I would invite Dr. Singh to wait for the presentation on the evaluation criteria. And then if there are still things open or you may have another question, we can, of course, deal with it then. Okay, there seems to be another question.
Shall I read it for you, sir?
I can see it because I have not yet opened the presentation mode.
It's by Nishant Sharma.
So there's a question by Nishant Sharma. Yesterday you mentioned while writing and submitting a paper, one should keep readers in mind. Should one strive to get acceptance of target audience or the review board? Well, you should have the reader in mind of the audience of the journal you are targeting for. And so there should actually be a convergence, of course, of the target audience and the review board, because the review board will evaluate a paper, whether it is relevant or interesting to the target audience of the journal. So I would not see a huge difference here between the target audience and the review board, because if the review board takes its role seriously and successfully, the role of the board, of course, is to make sure to be, let's say, kind of a gatekeeper, that only those articles get into the journal and are published that are really interesting and relevant to the audience that the journal wants to target. We have another question by Shweta Sharda. Can a review paper be substantiated with analysis by the author too? Yes, it should be substantiated with analysis, of course, because a review paper also should not just descriptively summarize what has been done in previous studies, but a good review paper, of course, has to analyze and has to provide some categories and some order that is used in order to scrutinize and to consolidate the findings that are to be gathered from the previous studies. So an own analysis by the authors actually is essential to come up with a good and also with a review paper that is meaningful for a high impact journal, because it has to go beyond just the summary and the description of what has been done before, but has to put this into perspective and to consolidate the state of knowledge. Okay, then we have a question from the foundation. Why do good journals take so long time, and in that time the data may become obsolete? Yes, that's a good question. So the journals take so long time for the review process because the review process, of course, takes time. We will deal with this also in our session today. What are actually the several steps that have to be taken for an evaluation of a manuscript that has been submitted to a high impact journal. But nonetheless, it's also the case that the turnaround time of the good journals actually vary. So we have journals with longer turnaround times, we have journals with shorter turnaround times. And of course, sometimes it also may be the case that there are exceptions for some unforeseen things. I don't know, a reviewer did not show up, or a reviewer did not respond to an invitation. This may delay the process. But speaking for CGIR, the journal that I'm the editor-in-chief of, we strive actually for a turnaround time of about 2 months to the authors. So to get to provide feedback within the turnaround time of 2 months. And then again, there may be exceptions, right? Because reviewers do not show up, reviewers do not provide their review report in time. But all the good journals, of course, also have in mind that quick feedback is important. Also, many young scholars, PhD students, or particularly young faculty members need these publications, of course, also in the good journals in order to get promoted, perhaps in order to get tenure. So it's certainly also the responsibility of the journals to do everything to speed up the review process without compromising its quality. And again, for CGIR, we strive for a turnaround time of about 2 months in order to provide feedback to authors. But I personally also had experiences from other journals that it took more than 8 months to receive feedback. So this, of course, is something that actually should not happen. Next question is by Poonam Sharma Sethi. Because we have developed expertise in a certain area, should then become a deterrent to explore other areas, in which case we may have to start from scratch, making the task more difficult? What suggestion would you give regarding this? Well, you have expertise in a certain area, and if the certain area still intrigues you and still leaves room for doing research, because there are still gaps, as we discussed yesterday, not only gaps, but also meaningful gaps, important gaps, research gaps for which you are able to show that they have a relevance and importance to the field, then I do not see necessarily why you should explore another area. Yeah. So as long as there is still room for research and you are interested in that, you could delve into it, right, and to become and to develop even more expertise in this certain area. And if you need to open up or explore another area, of course, well, you don't need to explore it from scratch, because the expertise that you have gained from the first area will hopefully help you, of course, also to get orientation and to learn faster in this new area. Hope this helps. Then we have a question by Yoti Paul. Please mention contemporary areas in corporate governance in which one can write conceptual papers. Well, I cannot give you a recipe. Yeah? That's what I said yesterday. But my suggestion is, and we will also come to this today in the session, in order to get ideas about where may be meaningful and important research gaps, probably that may also be interesting for a conceptual paper, simply carefully read research in the area you are interested in. And in all the good papers in the good journals, you will find a discussion section, which usually also opens up avenues for future research. And while you may not exactly pursue these avenues that are outlined in this discussion section, it may give you an idea and it may inspire you to see where are potential areas, also perhaps for a conceptual analysis and a conceptual paper. But it won't be fruitful to give you here now a list of 3 or 4 areas, because that's, of course, what we need to find out when we select, as discussed yesterday, an adequate research subject and research question. Question from Rinku Wadavan. The time taken by the high impact journals to review is long. That's what we also heard in the question before from the foundation. Is long, so that at times, in months time, they mail you that the topic or theme is not directly related to the journal. How to deal with it? Well, if the topic is not related to the journal, this is something we will also discuss today in our session when we talk about the submission and review process. Of course, this is something on the one hand that you should figure out carefully in advance, whether there is a sufficient fit of the topic that you study and the mission and scope that is covered by the journal. If you came to the assessment, there is a sufficient fit and submitted the paper, then of course I would also expect that the journal in general will not need months, as is written here in the comment, to find out that there is a misfit. I will come to this also in our session later today, but to share right here with you how is the policy at CGIR, at Corporate Governance and International Review. So we have a multi-stage evaluation process. And in the first stage of the process, so when the formal requirements are fulfilled, we have a screening process. So we have 2 screening editors whose major role is exactly this, to assess, is there a sufficient fit with the mission and the scope of the journal, and is there a sufficient potential promised by the paper. So we do this in a specific screening right at the beginning of the evaluation process. And we aim for providing this assessment, in case it's negative, to the authors within 2 weeks, so within 14 days, and usually we are much faster. So usually or very frequently, it's also the case that after 3 or 4 days, you receive a notice about a misfit, and then of course can move on and see whether there may be another journal that may be a better fit and a better outlet for this specific paper. So that would be my answer. You cannot deal with it another way. So it's unfortunate. And as I said, I would not expect such a kind of process and organization. So such feedback should be given very, very early in the process. And at least at CGIR, we really try also to deliver this. Question from Sakshi Mittal. How can we establish that the method or tool applied in our paper is not arbitrary? Is a good question, but a question that we will not be able to deal here in this workshop in sufficient depth and detail. So this is something we could think about a special methods workshop actually also to offer for the GRFCG. So just to give you a brief answer, and we will also deal with this later today. You have to make sure that you make transparent to the reader and to the reviewer why you have chosen a specific method. Yeah, so you should not simply use the method, you have to provide a rationale, a justification why for your specific research question, for your specific hypotheses that you are going to test, why in this setting the method that you have chosen is superior to other methods. And as we already mentioned yesterday, we have the page limitation, of course, that makes this very hard and very challenging because we cannot write 10, 20 pages about the selection of the method and provide a point-by-point comparison, perhaps to alternative or competing methods that we could have used. But my recommendation is, well, make such a point-by-point comparison also for your notes, for your files, for your own and personal substantiation, why you have chosen this method. Also for you to be sure it's not arbitrary, yeah, it's well substantiated. And then in writing up the paper, think about what are perhaps the 3, 4, 5 sentences that are most essential or most compelling to substantiate the choice of your method. And if the reviewers come up particularly with this issue, then you have in your own files a lot of additional arguments that you can then use in your response to the reviewers to substantiate in more detail why the choice was not arbitrary but well substantiated and thoughtfully prepared. Okay, whenever there are additional questions, just let me know. Otherwise, I will continue. Question from...
Definitely, sir.
Excuse me?
I will let you know whenever the other questions are asked. So once you start your presentation, I will be your eyes for the chat box.
Perfect, perfect. So I will continue with the questions in the chat before we start. I think we can, there are just 3 more.
Yeah, just 3 more questions, and after that we can start with the presentation.
So question by Reinish Jindal, what methods should be employed in legal research, especially in case of laws related to corporate governance, and how should it be differentiated with regard to financial aspects of the same subject? Is a very specific question that I think I will not be able to answer here in a very, very short way, because in legal research, of course, we also have a long tradition of empirical studies in law and in legal research. And we even have a tradition actually at the intersection of law and finance, also with very large scale and rigorous empirical studies. So, and the methods we can actually know, we cannot provide an answer about which methods should be employed without knowing what the research question is that we want to pursue, right? So the methods have to fit with your research question. So it's not possible to give here a general answer what methods, what method may be best. So it has to fit with the research question. There is a long tradition also of empirical and rigorous empirical research in law studies. And you may also want to scrutinize and read these previous studies, perhaps to get a better impression how also empirical research can be conducted in legal research. What's the Siksha Sachdeva asks, what's the maximum number of authors that can be there for a research paper? Is there a limit or any preference in high impact journals? No, there is no minimum or maximum number. So there's no journal that has kind of a ceiling, so more than 5 authors, more than 10 authors are not allowed. So there's no such formal criterion. What we observe, because of the very, very high demanding requirements of high impact journals, that single author papers have become really rare in high impact journals because of the very, very rich and diverse expertise with regard to theory, to methods, to writing up and so on is needed. So the vast majority of articles are co-authored articles, but there's not a maximum number of authors that is admissible. For your own planning, you have to keep in mind, well, the more authors you have, of course, you have more expertise and also more workload that you may be able to deal with. But at the same time, and that's the downside, the coordination costs, of course, increase tremendously. So I would keep this in mind. So as a thumb rule, and not as a formal requirement, but just as a thumb rule from practice, probably something like 3 to 5 authors most frequently may be a good number to have a sufficiently broad set of expertise and still be able to have a sufficiently intense interaction and coordination among all authors. Sakshi Ferma, if we develop a questionnaire according to our objectives, keeping in view the literature too, will it be a challenge to prove validity of our design instrument? Are standardized scales always considered better by the review board? Well, it's a specific question. Again, I cannot answer this precisely in general, but if I should disclose a preference, I would say yes. If you have not a strong validation of your self-developed instrument, in general, standardized scales and proven scales are viewed to be superior. Okay, so, and of course, it depends on your research question again. As I mentioned before, we cannot answer methods question irrespective of the specific research question that we want to answer. So if you have a research question indeed where it's impossible to rely on standardized and established scales, things are different. But in any case, if you have a research question and you develop your own scale, although there is a very, very similar related and proven scale, I would always strongly recommend to use the latter, because it relieves you from the burden to prove the validity and the reliability of your measurement. And we have another question from Rinku Vadavan. What if the topic becomes obsolete due to change in country laws and you're not getting much information on the public domain? Also, while doing primary research, respondents are not able to relate it with current scenario. Is changing the topic the only possibility? I don't know. This refers to the law question from above, or yeah. No, about the long,
No, that was
of
from
the long
different
review.
participants.
Well, it can of course always happen that over the time things change, right? And this may be laws that change. There may be crises that occur, financial crisis, COVID crisis that we were not aware of before. I think if you have a research question for a high impact journal, this should be sufficiently general that it may be less affected by such changes. So this could be one answer. Another answer would be particularly to the change in the country law, where then make sure that it refers to the state of country law when the data was collected. So this is not necessarily a disadvantage. Yeah? Just because the law has changed does not mean that we cannot learn something from the situation than it was 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. So I would then try to make it kind of a strength of the paper, because you have more distance, actually you had more time also to analyze the consequences compared to studying the situation as it is now after a new law has been enacted. Just make sure to be transparent about to which situation you refer, and just make sure also to clearly set the boundary conditions that it refers to this specific legal situation. And then in your discussion, you could perhaps also try to find what may be implications gathered from your analysis for the new legal situation after the new law has been enacted. Okay, and Nishant Sharma, your question we will deal with today. Actually, at the end of our session today, I will exactly deal with this. How should we move on, and how should we deal with the comments and the outcome, the eventual outcome of the review process? So thank you very much to all of you for the good questions following up from our yesterday's session. And if you don't mind, I would then continue with the agenda of our session today. And just give me a second to share my screen. Okay, Dr. Needy, can you see the slide?
Yes, sir, it is getting presented. Yeah, it is visible now.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. So let's move to the second day of our workshop. Dr. Needy was already so kind in her introduction earlier today to mention the topics that we want to deal with within the next 1.5 hours. And I have just moved, as you see here, the first agenda item from yesterday to our session today. So how to select an appropriate journal outlet and prepare the manuscript for submission. That builds actually on what we have discussed yesterday. And we will just provide some supplementary insights in this regard. And then we will deal with 5 questions actually to make it perhaps more transparent to you and give you more insights about how is actually the submission and review process of high impact journals organized, what are the roles editors and reviewers pursue, which criteria tend to be used to evaluate the quality of submitted manuscripts. Of course, with regard to these 3 questions, there are differences between high impact journals, but on a more general notion, I can give you some insights, I can share some experiences, how in general these issues are dealt with in high impact journals. And then the two last questions, and actually they also refer to the last comment that we just received in the chat. How should authors deal with feedback that they receive? Particularly, how should they deal with the feedback in the fortunate event that they have been invited to revise and resubmit their paper? And last question, how to deal with the eventual outcome? And the eventual outcome logically can only be either the paper is accepted or, unfortunately, the paper is rejected. And this was what the last question or comment in the chat function referred to. Okay, let's start selecting an appropriate journal outlet. That is something, of course, you should not do at the end of the research process, but you should always have in mind what could be a journal that you want to target with the research that are you conducting. So just some more general hints. What could you use as additional information to substantiate your decision, whether a journal outlet may be appropriate or not? First suggestion that I have, well, check what articles have you cited in your paper. Yeah? So have you cited articles from the journal that you want to submit to? Because the articles that you have cited actually indicate that you may build on a conversation that is relevant to the journal, right? So if you wrote up the paper, if you've done your research, and in several instances, you always came back to previous research, previous articles that have been published in a specific journal, this indicates the journal is relevant for your work because you elaborate on you utilize articles that have been published here before, and actually so this may indicate that you contribute to a conversation that seems to be interesting and relevant to that journal. On the other hand, if you say, well, I would like to submit my paper to journal A, and then you check your list of references and you see, well, I have not quoted even one article from journal A. Well, this is a bit strange, because if journal A is relevant for your research, if you think you want to target journal A, then it's quite surprising that none of the previously published articles in journal A have been cited in your paper. So this may rather indicate that there's not a good fit, that there's a misfit, because the conversation that is pursued in journal A apparently is detached and not related to the conversation that you lead in your article. So make sure you have sufficient correspondence between the journal and actually also the references that you use in your own paper. In order to get a better picture of what are potentially relevant journals that you may want to analyze as eligible or non-eligible outlets, check journal lists. Yeah, so check journal lists to see what kind of journals actually are on the market. But again, like the comment before about the misfit, if there is a journal that seems to be potentially relevant, but that did not come across to you during all your prior hard and intense research work, then check carefully whether this journal, although perhaps the title sounds interesting, perhaps although the title may indicate a good fit, whether there is really a good match between your paper and this journal. In any case, this selection decision needs to be well substantiated. We also heard this from your comments before in the chat at the beginning of our session today. It sometimes happens that there is not a good fit between the paper and the journal. And even worse, if some journals need a long time, as you also have indicated, to provide the feedback of a misfit, then you have just waited without any progress for quite a while, although perhaps you may have been able before on your own to assess whether there's a sufficient fit or not. So check very carefully the scope and mission of the journal outlet you may be interested in. Also read carefully several issues and many articles of this specific journal in order to honestly assess is the overall quality and positioning of the articles that are previously published in this journal really in line with my paper. So does my paper really look similar, really promise to meet the bar of these previously published journals? Of course, we should set us highly demanding targets, but these targets also need to be realistic. It does not make sense to set illusory targets. So the bottom line is we need a good fit between the paper and the journal, and the good fit, and every author should honestly make this self-assessment before submission. Is there a good fit between the research question of your paper and the scope and mission of the journal, and compared to articles that have been previously published in this journal, does my article look similar? Does my article promise to meet a similar bar of quality? When you have selected your journal outlet, you need to prepare your manuscript for submission. And some of these points here appear to be trivial. It's a bit like what I also mentioned yesterday with regard to writing up the paper. But these do's and don'ts actually are essential. And as an editor and reviewer, I observe, unfortunately, much too often that some, if not many, of these rather trivial issues are ignored. And of course, this is not helpful for the fate and the success of the submission. So strictly follow the author guidelines provided by the journal. Go to the webpage of the journal, check and download the author guidelines, and then be very, very compliant with what is expected with regard to the font type, with regard to the font size, with regard to margins, with regard to the style of references, with regard to how tables and figures should look like, and so on and so on. So if the journal provides such guidelines, be strictly in compliance with them. Preparing the manuscript for submission, of course, also includes what we have mentioned yesterday with regard to writing up the paper. Be precise, avoid being wordy, always provide precise definitions whenever a term, construct, concept, or variable is used for the first time in the paper. And very, very important, use these terms and labels consistently throughout the manuscript. Coming back to a question that was raised by you in the chat with regard to the maximum number of authors. So if you have a co-authored paper, if you have multiple authors on a paper, and they all provide to writing up the manuscript, then make sure at the end, before submission, that there is consensus about definitions, terms, and labels, and that they have been used consistently by everyone. So this leads to the next point. Before submission, proofreading is essential, careful proofreading, and you cannot do too much proofreading. Yeah? So better proofread your manuscript several times. Avoid that there are typos, avoid that there are things left out, avoid that there are redundancies. So proofread your manuscript very, very carefully several times before submission. You should ask colleagues to provide a friendly review before submission. So get feedback from your own network, from your own community of colleagues, maybe even from another field, not necessarily working, for example, on corporate governance, may help to get an devil's advocate opinion about clarity, about flow, about structure of your manuscript, but also get feedback from your network of corporate governance scholars before submission, and ask them to provide a friendly review. And of course, as a tit for tat, and in return, you should also then be available for these friends and colleagues to provide a friendly review for their paper before submission. So I think this is very, very important and helpful, because the reviewers should not be your first readers. You should have received feedback before from other sources before then the reviewers evaluate your manuscript. And it may also be helpful, besides soliciting friendly reviews from colleagues, to also think about submitting your manuscript to conferences or workshops to receive, in addition, perhaps even more in-depth comments and feedback that may help you to strengthen your contribution before a journal submission. Okay, so there are sometimes specialized paper development workshops that may be helpful. We have all these annual conferences where you may want to submit your work first. Some of these conferences even have their own review process from which you receive feedback. Some conferences will have even discussants that provide feedback on your manuscript. You present your manuscript at these conferences. There are Q&As, there are discussions about your manuscripts. All these things will help you to strengthen your idea and to become more and more clear about the core and about the contribution of your manuscript. Okay, are there any questions? Otherwise, I would move on to the organization of the submission and review process, and take a bit more now the perspective of the journal, while we had before very much taken the perspective of the author.
So there is only one question, and it's related to the timing taken by the journals only. It's by Mr. Naveen Kumar. He's a whole-time director at PFC, and he wants to know if there is an average review time that all the good journals have, or is it decided case-to-case basis, depending upon the editor-in-chief of the journal?
Yeah. Well, some journals publish the average turnaround time that they have. But as I said, there is huge difference also between some journals. I think on average, it's fair to say to expect a feedback of a formal review after 3 to 4 months. I think all the high impact journals would agree that at least normally they want to be in a position to provide feedback to authors after 3 to 4 months. So this would be my answer. There are some journals that try to be faster. I mentioned CGIR is one of them. So of course, sometimes it also happens that we need 3 months. But we want to be actually on average faster with our feedback that we provide to authors. But there are always things that could happen within the review process that may, in single instances, lead to a delay. And of course, you as an author, you are interested in the single instance, not in the average number, because you are affected by the single instance. The average number is just what we could expect on average. And so to respond to the question, I would say for high impact journals, they try to provide feedback within 3 to 4 months to authors.
Okay.
Thank you for the question. So then, let's take a look. Why does it take so long to provide this feedback? So how is actually the submission and review process organized by the high impact journals? To get information about this, you should also check the webpage of the journal to see what kind of information and how transparent is the journal actually about which steps have to be taken during the submission process and how the whole review process is organized, what are perhaps different stages that have to be followed during the review process. So again, the journals vary in this regard. Check the webpage carefully in order to get as much information as possible about it in advance. In general, all high impact journals, so there are just very, very few, one or two exceptions, all the high impact journals, they utilize an electronic, meaning internet-based system to receive and handle submissions. So of course you don't send them per snail mail. Of course, you also do not send them anymore by email, but there is an internet-based manuscript system where you actually create an account, and then you have the possibility to provide all the information about the authors and eventually to submit electronically the file of your manuscript, and if needed also supplementary material in additional files. Make sure during the submission process, this is similar to what I have already mentioned with regard to the preparation of the manuscript, all formal requirements need to be taken into consideration. So full compliance is essential. This is one of the issues that may also delay the review process. If authors sometimes forget or ignore to provide information that is requested during the submission process. So be very careful here to make sure to comply with all the formal requirements and to provide all the information that is requested during the submission process. In the worst case, if you miss some of these requirements, if you do not provide some of the information, in the very worst case, it could lead to rejection. In the less worse, but nonetheless inferior case, it will lead to a delay in the process, because then the editorial assistant or the managing editor has to get back to you, has to request either to make these formal adjustments or to provide these information, and all this of course will decelerate the whole process. So these are all formal issues, and as I said, you have to see and check carefully what the journal requires, and then to fully comply with all the requirements. Some journals require, but not all journals formally require to provide a cover letter. My personal recommendation to you is, even if the journal does not require a cover letter, do nonetheless voluntarily provide such a cover letter. In the cover letter, you have the possibility to explain to the editors, very brief, what is actually the novel contribution of your paper and why is it a good fit with the journal that you have chosen. Of course, this should also be clear from reading perhaps the abstract at the introduction of your paper. So this is not a substitute for the information provided in the paper. This complements the information that you provide in the paper. So just provide a few sentences that very, very clearly explain and justify what's new here and why is it interesting for Journal A that you have chosen as your outlet. Even if it's not formally required, some journals require this, some journals do not. My recommendation is to make use of this opportunity, also actually to signal to the editor that you have not just arbitrarily or randomly chosen this journal, but have well substantiated your decision and have good arguments why you think your paper is worth to be considered for inclusion in this journal. If there are no questions, I would continue.
There's only one question regarding it's
it.
about the review process, majorly, wherein Dr. Shikha Menani, she is asking that how to deal with the situation if we get contradictory review from the reviewers.
I will come to this later. Please save the question. I
will
get to this later.
Okay.
So just mention it, Dr. Nidhi, when we are at this point. Okay.
Yes, sir. It's noted. Yes, sir.
Okay, so this is how the submission process is organized. I think bottom line is, like always, due diligence and care is important. So be fully compliant with what is requested. And this means, of course, that first of all, you have to have carefully checked all the requirements. Sometimes journals offer the opportunity to make a recommendation which handling editor you prefer. Some journals provide the opportunity that you may indicate preferred reviewers, but also reviewers that you may not prefer. But again, this differs from journal to journal, and you should check whether the journal requests such information or not. And if the journal does not request the information, in these cases, actually, I would refrain from voluntarily making a recommendation about a preferred editor, a preferred reviewer, or a non-preferred reviewer. But irrespective of the formal requirement, as I had said, my recommendation is to prepare and to provide a cover letter that supplements your submission. So then what happens next? Actually, what are the persons or roles involved in the review process, and what are their specific tasks and responsibilities? And again, as I mentioned before, there are differences between the high impact journals. So they have different terminology. They have also different divisions of tasks and responsibilities. But on a more general notion, we can say, well, at the apex of the process, there is the editor-in-chief, which leads the whole process and assigns and handling editor. So at the high impact journals, we usually have something between, let's say, 2 to 4 co-editors-in-chief. But we receive several hundred submissions per year. So of course, it's naturally simply impossible to handle all of these personally by just a very few persons. And this is why all the high impact journals have below the level of the editors-in-chief handling editors. There's different terminology. Some journals call them senior editors, handling editor, associate editor, or just editor. And so the editor-in-chief assigns the manuscript to the handling editor. But before this happens, all the high-impact journals have some type of pre-screening before reviewers are assigned. And this pre-screening is organized, again, differently from journal to journal. I had already mentioned at the beginning of our session today, at Corporate Governance and International Review, we have 2 specialized screening editors. So they do nothing else, or their main responsibility is to pre-screen all the manuscripts that we receive in order to see whether they meet minimum quality criteria and fit with the mission and the scope of the journal. When this pre-screening was successful, and in some other journals, this pre-screening is done by the EIC or by the editor. But this pre-screening may lead to either a rejection, or it may lead to the next stage of the reviewing process. And usually then the next stage is to assign a handling editor. The handling editor again will pre-screen and may overrule the recommendation of the screening editor and may decide to desk reject the paper. Or the handling editor follows the recommendation of the screening editor, and then his first responsibility is to assign the reviewers. So after the successful screening, the handling editor selects, invites, and assigns roundabout between, at the end, 2 to 4 reviewers for the, as you know, and this is important, double-blind review process. So double-blind process means the authors are unknown to the reviewers, and also the reviewers are unknown to the authors, right? So this means double-blind review process in order to hopefully have a more objective and less biased evaluation of the manuscript. Then the journals provide some turnaround time to the authors to submit submit to the reviewers to submit their referee report. Again, this timeline is different from journal to journal. At CGIR, we expect this review report by the referees within 5 weeks. There are also journals that provide 8 weeks or 10 weeks, and then of course also the whole review process it takes longer. And the handling editor, when he assigns the reviewers, of course he has to pay attention that there is a sufficient set of expertise among the group of assigned reviewers with regard to the field of research, with regard also to the methods that are employed, perhaps also with regard to the context of the specific study. So this is what the handling editor actually needs to carefully balance, that all the different aspects of the paper that needs to be evaluated, that all these expertise is also covered by the group of reviewers. Then after the referee reports have been resubmitted, the editor carefully reads all the reports, summarizes the comments that is provided by the reviewers, and then makes on this base a substantiated recommendation about the manuscript that is eventually shared with the authors, right? And of course, this a recommendation again could be either a rejection because it turned out that there are 2 serious concerns that were discovered in the review process that can hardly be overcome in a revision, or the reviewers, and particularly the editor, and then also the editor-in-chief who has to sign up usually this recommendation, they all come to the conclusion that there are concerns, but that these concerns could hopefully be addressed and overcome in a revision, and then the authors are invited to revise and resubmit their manuscript. And I will come to this stage of the process a bit later. So this is basically how the process is organized and what the roles of editors and reviewers are. My personal recommendation here to all of you is try to get more experiences also with the review process, not only as an author, not only by submitting manuscripts to journals and to conferences with a review process. Try also to get experiences with the review process by serving as a reviewer, right? So it will not be possible to voluntarily review for the high impact journals because they usually don't accept self-nominations but select the reviewers. But nonetheless, there are other occasions where you could volunteer. Just think, for example, of some of the international organizations and conferences like Academy of Management or International Corporate Governance Society. So they usually accept also self-nominations for reviewers. And so this may be an opportunity to get some experience here also from this perspective. And I also recommend this to you because if you take the lens of the reviewer, you will also learn when you've done this several times, well, how actually is a reviewer reading a manuscript? What does he pay or she pay attention for? And this, the other way around, will help you to be more careful in the crafting of your manuscript because you know what are some of the concerns that reviewers usually bring up and how can I, anticipating these, avoid them in writing up my own manuscript. So I think it's a good opportunity to gain more experiences and to gain more insights in the process. And of course, also if you are invited by a journal to review, it's time consuming, no doubt. But if you want to publish in high impact journals, if you want to publish in journals that rely on the double blind review process, I think we all also have the responsibility to provide such services, although they are time consuming and require care and efforts because it rests actually on these voluntary contributions of all of us.
We have a couple of questions, sir, if we can take them up right now.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So one question is by Mr. Nishant Sharma. He wants to know that how is cover letter distinguished from the abstract of the paper? Mm-hmm. And also I'll join another question into this. It has been asked by Dr. Rinku. She's asking that, is it a good idea to first send a mail to the editor with details about the novel idea behind the paper through this covering letter maybe, and check for the interest, or we should directly submit the paper only?
Mm-hmm. So I start with the first question, difference between abstract and cover letter. With regard to the abstract, there are also often formal requirements by the journal, right? So if you check the formal requirements, they may have specific expectations with regard to the lengths of the abstract. At CGIR, we expect from all authors to provide a structured abstract. Yeah, so we have a specific structure that needs to be applied to the abstract. And in the cover letter, you are not constrained by such formal requirements, okay? So you are completely free, actually, in thinking about what are the points that I want to make in order to attract interest by the editor. And of course, it's not completely different. It's not completely detached, because the core argument, the core idea why there is a good fit is, of course, also mentioned in the abstract, right? So there's not something completely different, something completely new in the cover letter compared to the abstract. Of course, both documents need to converge, right? But you have the possibility to use some other framing and to be less constrained by the formal requirements that usually apply to the design and the writing up of the abstract. And a second point I would like to emphasize here is particularly the fit of your paper and the scope and the mission of the journal is something we usually do not explicitly mention in the abstract or the introduction, right? So you don't find there a sentence and because of this and this and this, this is a good fit for this specific journal. So this is what the reader, of course, simply takes for granted, because otherwise the paper is not would not have been published in this journal. So, but this fit between your paper and the scope and mission of the journal is something you can actually deal this more explicitly and make much more transparent in the cover letter. So, for example, you could also mention in the cover letter, and you would not do this in the abstract, you could say, well, we particularly built on Article 1, Article 2, Article 3 that were published in your journal. Yeah? And we agree with Article 1 in this regard, and we advance Article 2 in that regard, and we show that Article 3 may have ignored a boundary condition because of that and that. So this is what you could actually much more explicitly and much more straightforward explain in the cover letter.
Right.
And the second question was about, is it a good idea to, before a submission, to approach the editor whether there is a sufficient fit of the research theme and the journal?
Yeah.
Well, let's put it this way, it's not forbidden, but I would not expect too much from it. So I mentioned before, so the high impact journals, they receive several hundred manuscripts per year. Just imagine that all these manuscripts, before they are submitted, they have an informal request whether it's worth to submit.
Yeah, it will increase a lot of work.
Yeah, we don't have just 600 or 700 submissions. We also have 600, 700 requests to deal with. So my recommendation is not to do it. You can do it, but what happens? So if the editor says, well, just give it a try, then you have to give it a try, but nothing is won because the screening may lead for some other reason to a rejection. So there is no binding, no bindingness of the response that you receive, right? Because the response is out of the formal review process. And if the editor responds, well, I don't think it's a good paper, I don't think it's a good fit, and you are convinced it is, then perhaps given it a trial, so then this chance actually is over. So my personal recommendation, you can do it as you want. My personal recommendation is I would not do it because of the high number of manuscripts the high impact journals have to deal with in any case. And because the response that you receive may not really be helpful for the further process. So this would be my response to this question. Nonetheless, you could, of course, informally try to illuminate this question. So again, if you go to the conferences, right? So if you present your paper at the conference, and then perhaps within the session, you see, well, there is someone who has already published in this journal. There is someone who has is an editor of the journal. Then you could simply ask, perhaps after the session, do you feel there is a sufficient fit or not? But
so at informal level, we can do that.
Informal level, you could do it on particularly because this is exchange that on such conferences could actually be very efficiently also be sought for. And yeah, I think that's how I would respond to that question.
So we move on to the next question then. It's by Dr. Sameer Lama. He wants to know that if no acknowledgement has been received for over 9 to 10 months after the submission of manuscript, then should the author wait for some more time or withdraw the paper and submit in some other journal?
Well, I would not say the options are either to wait or to withdraw. After 10 months, I would recommend, if it's really 10 months without getting any feedback by the journal, I would write a very, very polite, although I know you are very frustrated, but nonetheless, write a very, very polite request that you have submitted this and that manuscript 10 months ago, and you would kindly like to know when to expect a response and whether there is anything else that that may be requested from your side. Yeah, that's what I would do. And then you see what the response by the journal is. So hopefully it speeds up the process if someone has really, I don't know, got into winter sleep or summer sleep or whatever. But 10 months, as I said before, actually is unacceptable. But in all the conversation, I think this is also very, very important always to keep in mind, because I also know as an author how frustrating it is, of course, to get papers rejected and to get delayed responses. But politeness in the conversation, I think, is important. It won't help to become harsh, although you may be inclined to become so. So in this case, after 10 months, not the option wait, simply wait and do nothing or withdraw. Then you withdraw, and perhaps 2 days later, you would have received an invitation to revise and resubmit. So this would be, of course, very annoying. Just ask for, very polite, ask for clarification. Is there anything open from your side that may have caused the delay? And why, if not, so could they give a broad estimation when to expect a response? And if then you get no answer again, let's say for another couple of weeks, then I would withdraw, because then I would not understand what's going on in that journal.
Yeah. Okay, so our next question is from Dr. Sunaina Kanodia. She wants to know that if we select a journal which has already published a number of papers on the subject on which we are submitting the paper, does it act negatively?
No, it does not add negatively. In contrast, it will add positively if you have everything done that we have discussed yesterday. So if your research question, of course, is new, and if your contribution goes beyond that what has been published before. So if these two conditions are fulfilled, so the research question is new and important, and your contribution is theoretically meaningful, then it's actually ideal that you have other papers in this stream of research that are related to your own paper. So, but if you do not provide something really new, if your contribution is perhaps only incrementally more than what these previously published articles have already delivered, then it will be probably less likely that the paper is considered. Then you should perhaps move perhaps to a less or lower quality journal that may still be interested for this more incremental or only incremental contribution.
Okay. Next question, sir, is from Dr. Urvashi Sharma. She's asking that in case we have to quote different cases of companies in HR area or in governance area, do we have to take permission from the concerned person or organization, or we can take it from a quoted source? What will be the correct way of giving the examples?
It depends on the material you are referring for, right? So when you, if it is material that the company has published, then of course you disclose the source and include the source. If it is a primary data that you collect from the company, then you should, of course, at the beginning of the process, have made an agreement with the company how to deal with it. Because usually the company may want to have confidentiality of the information that is provided to you as a researcher as privileged information, and then the name of the company has to remain non-disclosed. So if I got the question correct, it depends on the kind of material, the kind of information that you use or that you quote in the paper. And so if it is publicly available, you do not need to get permission by the company, but you have to disclose and make transparent in the paper and to the reader where this data and this material comes from. If it is information that you have hand collected, primary data that you have collected by interviews, by surveys, by observations within this specific company, then at the beginning of the research, you should have made an agreement with the company to lay down how to deal and how to process and how to utilize this privileged data.
Yeah. So we have few questions which relate to the criteria that is used. I think that you will be covering in your upcoming slides. So I'm leaving on those questions as of now. And I think we can take it later once you have covered that area.
Yes, we will come to that point as well.
Yeah.
So, and exactly, no, I've left out, no, we had this, it's exactly where we are now, the criteria that are now used in the review process. So again, the evaluation criteria, check them in advance. They vary between the journals. Some journals disclose the evaluation criteria on their webpage. Some journals do not. In the review process, some journals require from their reviewers to score a specific set of criteria with regard whether they are completely fulfilled or not fulfilled at all, so on kind of a Likert scale. And with all the differences, I think it's fair to say broadly, criteria refer to the 5 areas that I have listed here on slide number 21. So the criteria that reviewers are requested to use in their evaluation of the manuscript, and of course that are also used by the editor and everyone who is involved in the evaluation, irrespective of whether there is a scoring system or not, or whether just to deal with these criteria in the verbal report of the reviewer and the editor. So usually the criteria refer to the fit of the subject with the scope and mission of the journal. So we have already or mentioned this several times during our workshop. So this is apparently an up or out criterion, right? So if there's not a sufficient fit actually at the beginning of the process, hopefully at the beginning of the process within the pre-screening, this should lead to exclusion of the paper. But nonetheless, even if the pre-screening still assessed a sufficient fit, of course, it can turn out in a more in-depth evaluation, in a more in-depth and detailed review of the paper that eventually the fit may turn out to be less pronounced than initially expected. So fit of subject with the scope and mission of the journal is usually one criterion. Conceptual clarity and contribution of the manuscript, technical adequacy and transparency, particularly with regard, of course, to empirical studies. Clarity of exposition and writing. Yeah, at the end of our session yesterday, we talked about writing up the manuscript, what effort is needed, and that this is very hard work. And frequently also rejections follow from that writing because it is not sufficiently clear, it was not sufficiently compellingly communicated to the reader what the paper is about. And last but certainly not least, the overall significance of the contribution. So is the contribution that is provided by the study significant enough really to deserve publication in a high impact journal, or is it just a very, very incremental contribution that is made? This may also be sufficient for publication, but then not in a high impact journal. Okay. I will delve into this a bit because you also had previously questions naturally about the criteria that are used in the evaluation process. And I would like to share with you a bit more details about how the process is organized at CGIR. This is not published on our webpage, so so to speak, it's privileged information, but of course it's not a secret, it's not confidential, so you can also share with your colleagues and perhaps PhD students. So whenever at CGIR a paper has survived the screening process, has been assigned to an editor, the editor again screens it, and if the editor also agrees this paper is worth to be sent out to review, then, as I mentioned before, this handling editor selects a number of reviewers and invites reviewers. And in this invitation letter, the reviewer gets information about the timeline of the review, and most importantly, the abstract of the paper. So then the reviewer can assess, well, am I available within the next 5 weeks really to conduct the review? And is the review based on the abstract that is provided within my field of expertise? Of course, the editor has checked this before, but the reviewer is expected also to validate that he has the necessary expertise to evaluate the manuscript. If the reviewer accepts the invitation to review, and if he then is assigned as a reviewer for this specific manuscript, in the letter of assignment, we share with the reviewer our reviewing guidelines. Okay, and this is what I now also would like to share with you to make more transparent actually how this process is organized. So we start again with explaining what's the mission actually of CGIR in order to make sure that the reviewer is on the same page here and is able to evaluate that the paper really contributes to the mission of the journal. So we explain corporate governance and international review seeks to be the premier scholarly outlet for international corporate governance research that is both rigorously done and relevant to practitioners. So the research that we seek for needs to be both rigorous and relevant. And then we briefly characterize what is meant by these two characteristics. Rigorous research builds or tests extant theory, contains clear definitions of constructs and well-specified relationships, and demonstrates the command of previous literature and is overall methodologically sound. Okay, this is how we would characterize rigorous research. And at this point, I can already respond to the question in the chat before we started the agenda of our second workshop day. I think it was a question by Dr. Sethi about how to evaluate the rigor of conceptual papers. And as you can see here, if we define rigorous research the way we do, then the overall criterion of rigor is not restricted only to empirical studies. So of course, also conceptual studies need to build extant theory. They won't test, but they need to build or contribute or advance extant theory. And they need to contain clear definitions of constructs and well-specified relationships and demonstrate a command of previous literature. So all this, of course, also applies to conceptual papers. So rigor in this sense is captured in a broad way that is not restricted only to empirical research. So, but we do not only search for rigorous research, but corporate governance and international review as a journal that is interested in corporate governance, which is a subject, as we all know, is highly important also for practice. We seek for research that is relevant, meaning it asks research questions that practitioners also care about. So this research addresses real problems which practitioners or policymakers are wrestling with, and offers insights to practitioners and or policymakers that can assist them in governing corporations better. So we are not interested in, let's say, la pour la research, but we are interested in research that really has governance practice also in mind, and provides insights, even if on a more general level, that can eventually provide potential also to improve and influence governance practice. Okay, then there are some information about the confidentiality of the review process. Of course, the reviewers are only allowed to evaluate the manuscript for this review process. They are not allowed to share the manuscript or any information from this manuscript with someone else than the editor. What do we expect now from reviewers with regard to their referee report? At CGIR, we want to have polite and developmental referee reports. So we emphasize that in our communication with authors, the reviewers should apply a polite tone with honest appraisal of what has been done in this manuscript. So referees should be polite in tone and friendly to the authors. So we do not accept any kind of harsh language. But at the same time, being polite and friendly, of course, does not mean to be dishonest about what the potential of the manuscript is. Of course, this has to be clearly mentioned and frankly laid out, but in a polite and friendly and constructive manner. We are aware at CGIR as a journal that actually search for submissions from scholars from all over the world, that many of them may not have English as their native language. Of course, there is the possibility, and I actually also strongly recommend to make use of this possibility to have some language editing before submission. But language issues, we try to have them not as the criterion why a manuscript is not considered further. So if the reviewer sees there are problems with the language, then the reviewer should not indicate each and every single typo, spelling, or grammar mistake, but simply should encourage and recommend authors to seek professional editing in rewriting the manuscript. And again, this is something, at least for authors with less proficiency of English, I would always recommend to do this before submission, because it can simply distract even the well-intentioned reader from the core and from the message of the paper, if there are too many language issues. Okay, and then the important thing is, besides the politeness in tone, we want to have developmental reviews, meaning they should be constructive guidance for the authors. Irrespective of the outcome, revise or resubmit or rejection, we want to provide them constructive developmental feedback. What needs to be addressed in the paper to become better? What are the strengths? What are the concerns that have been identified in the evaluation process? We ask for this purpose our reviewers to structure their comments into major and minor concerns. Yeah, so to help the authors also to see what are the most important issues, the crucial issues that really need substantial improvement, and what are perhaps more minor concerns that may probably also be dealt with much more easily. We ask reviewers not only to raise concerns, but also to identify the strengths of a paper. So the reviewer should indicate at least briefly what is the current contribution, what is the strengths of the manuscript besides the weaknesses that a manuscript naturally, of course, also has. So to allow our authors to feel good about the strengths that the manuscript has, but also to learn where they can still improve the paper. With regard to the concerns, reviewers should be specific about the problems. So they should not just simply say, this is wrong or this is a problem. They should explain why this is wrong or why this is a problem. And ideally, they even may make some suggestions how this problem could be overcome, how this problem might be addressed by the authors. And finally, they should provide an overall assessment of the contribution of the manuscript. And again, in terms of both the theoretical and the practical implications of the paper. So in terms of both the rigor and the relevance of the research. Timeliness, I have already mentioned this. 5 weeks is the timeline that we usually provide to reviewers. Of course, we grant extensions if they are non-avoidable and needed. And we ask reviewers to indicate when they are unavailable. Again, also to avoid avoidable delays in the review process. And then the reviewer is also asked to check whether within the field of research the paper is about, all the key literature actually is incorporated, or whether there are key citations that are missing. In this case, reviewers are requested actually to indicate missing key literature to the authors. And then finally, in the response to the authors in the review report that is also disclosed to the authors, the reviewer makes a final assessment, final overall assessment, but he does not disclose, he is requested not to disclose a final recommendation about acceptance, revise or resubmit, major revision or rejection in the paper, because this is made and then also disclosed actually at CGIR by the editor-in-chief at the end of the process. So usually also the editor, not necessarily, the handling editor, not necessarily makes the final decision completely explicit. Okay, I'm pretty sure we have some questions now here about
Yes, we have. First is by Dr. Gunjan. She wants to know that what is the criteria for selection of reviewers by the international organizations or even by the journals, high impact journals?
Yeah. The criteria for selecting reviewers, of course, is that the reviewers have in-depth knowledge of the field of research that the article is about. So this is actually the overall criterion, and this expertise should be proven by publications in the field, and ideally also by prior reviews for the journal and prior reviews in the field. So this is the ideal set. And of course, if you have a paper, then a paper is a complex thing. And so as a good editor, you try to make sure that that various aspects that need to be evaluated of a manuscript are sufficiently covered by the set of reviewers that you assign. Yeah? So there may be one reviewer who is a strong expert of the theory that is employed. There is one reviewer, but perhaps the method is a very new, very fancy method, and you know, reviewer A, he has not used this method yet. Then you try to have someone also, another reviewer, who has knowledge and experience of this novel, fancy method. Yeah, and perhaps also the context is specific, right? So then we also want to have someone who has knowledge of the context in which the study is settled. So this is what we do. So to have the necessary set of expertise that is needed to evaluate a manuscript. Ideally, all the reviewers have all the expertise, but sometimes you also need to have some kind of division of expertise among the group of reviewers. And the expertise is indicated by, well, their establishment in the field, by the publications that they have already provided, and ideally also by reviews they have successfully done before for CGIAR. Reviews they have done for CGIAR before, I can also mention here at this point, every review provided to CGIAR is evaluated by the editor and the editor-in-chief with regard to the timeliness and with regard to the quality of the review. Okay, and so for each reviewer, for each individual person serving as a reviewer, we have a track record, how timely this person has delivered his reports in case the person was assigned, and how has the quality been assessed of these prior reviews. And of course, if again someone was too frequently delayed, if someone has delivered reviews that did not meet our expectations of review quality, such a person will not be invited again and be eventually banned from our pool of reviewers. So there's also a review of the reviewers, so to speak. There's also an evaluation of those who evaluate the manuscript. And if they perform poorly, they will not be invited again. If they perform well, we try to appoint them to our editorial board to have them really committed then also to provide a sufficient number of reviews every year and to be sure that we are able to tap their expertise. Thank you.
I am really sorry, I lost my connection and I have to join back again.
Okay, but I was still at the question that you asked before.
Yeah, I'll now request Dr. Poonam Sharma. Poonam ma'am, can you please take up the further questions because they are now no longer showing in my chat box.
Oh, I see.
Poonam ma'am.
Or I could interrupt.
Yeah, she's there. Yeah, please, ma'am.
Yes. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, it will, I just need to, I think I'm also having some.
Okay, but I could interrupt also the presentation and mode, and then I will see the...
Are we at Dipali Malhotra?
Yes.
Okay, Professor Till, should I ask the question?
Okay, if it's fine for you, that would be excellent.
Yeah. Yes. So we have a question from Dipali Malhotra. She is asking, shall we cite both type of studies in our analysis, which are in contrast and which are in accordance with our results?
Yes, it's not only that you should, I would be even more stricter in my response. You must. You must, yes. You cannot be selective in your citations. You cannot just refer to those studies that are in line with your results and ignore the ones that contradict your findings. This would not be good academic practice. but you have to deal with both. And it's nice to have converging validation by those studies that are in line with your findings. But if you have also prior studies that are contradicting your findings, then of course you have to deal with this and have to discuss why does this probably happened? Yeah? What may explain this divergence? And so you are not allowed to ignore these studies. And in contrast, I would say it's a good opportunity for you if you have such conflicting findings and if you have done your study properly, also with all the rigor needed, because this may be something where you could build your own and unique contribution on. So remember our session yesterday, and we actually concluded, or one of our conclusion was the meaningful contribution, the novel, theoretically relevant and important contribution of an article is important to be published in a high impact journal, but is frequently also one of the most challenging, one of the toughest things to achieve. And so if you have these conflicting findings, there's another study published in a high impact journal, rigorously done. You have done your study rigorously with another sample, with another setting in another year. This could be something actually to delve into, to compare and to figure out in your discussion what's new here. Yeah? So what are your insights that go beyond this prior study because the findings are not in line?
Thank you, Poonam ma'am. I have received the questions, so I'll continue now. Next question we have from Dr. Pooja. She wants to know that when we send a paper, when we submit a paper in high impact journals, many of them require us to refer international reviewers. So if we are not in direct contact with any of them, can we still provide the names of renowned international authors in that area?
Yeah, that's what I mentioned before. It's a very good question. Some of the journals, they request, as this question refers to, some of the journals request recommendations of preferred reviewers. And in this case, you do not have to personally know the reviewer. It may actually even be risky if you know personally the reviewer, because keep in mind, the review process has to be, where is it? Has to be double blind, right? So here, the authors have to be unknown to the reviewer, and the reviewer has also to have no knowledge of the authors. So if you don't know the person personally, if you have not sent the manuscript to this person before, if you have not presented at the conference, then there's also a good chance that this person may be assigned as a reviewer. Yeah. So if you know the person personally, if you have presented the paper before to this person, if you were at a conference and this person was your discussant, then such a person actually has to decline the invitation to review because it would compromise the double-blind review process. So brief answer to the question, check carefully, again, based on your paper, based on your research, based on the citations, based on the literature that you have incorporated, and just think, in an ideal world, who would be a good reader for my paper? Who would be interested in what I have done here? And then recommend such a person. And personal knowledge is not a prerequisite. It's even helpful because it avoids the risk that the recommended person declines the invitation because of a compromise of the double blindness of the process.
Okay, thank you, sir. Next question is by Ms. Swecha. She is asking that can we pick and choose which comments to address?
No, I come to this point in a second.
Okay, okay. And Dr. Shweta is asking that what is the weightage which is assigned to methodology used in empirical paper based on qualitative data?
What is the
Weightage. Weightage that is assigned to the methodology that is being used in empirical paper.
Well,
In the
there
review.
is not a strict scoring model in the sense that this is 30%, 40%, or 50%. Yeah, so even those journals who have a specific scoring of criteria that they request from their reviewers, usually it's not that they assign a specific percentage or a specific weight to each of the criteria. So to put the answer or to give a short answer, irrespective of the weight of the criteria, if one of the criterion is not sufficiently met, the paper will not survive. And if you have an empirical paper or even a qualitative empirical study, then of course the methodological rigor is very essential. And then in the evaluation process, the reviewers and the editors have just to see, is this something that can be healed? Is this something that can be addressed? Or is it so weighty that it has actually not really a chance to be convincingly addressed?
Yeah.
So I would not steer on weights or on percentages. I would steer on the holistic set of criteria, and all of the dimensions have to be covered.
Okay.
So you cannot say, well, I have a good fit with a journal, so I don't have to care about conceptual clarity, right?
Yeah.
So this will not help. And if it's conceptual clear, if there's no fit, there's no fit. So you have to deal with all the criteria and all the dimension of the evaluation. And there is no substitution that one criteria could substitute for others.
Yeah. Okay. So Mr. Naveen Kumar wants to know that what is the significance of the Thomas Reuter indexation that we have with respect to the academic writing in high impact journals, the Thomas Reuter scale that we have for impact factor.
What? Say it again.
Thomas Reuter scale that we have for the impact factors of the journal, which gives a list of impact factor for the journals. What is its significance with respect to the academic writing for high impact journals? Is there any linkage? Do we have to see that also?
Well, there is a linkage in the sense, if I got the question right, that of course the Thompson listing is one listing that tries to evaluate the overall quality of journals. And there are other listings as well. And as I recommended, you should consult such listings also to get a better idea about actually which journals may in principle be interesting for your research, and depending on the ranking and the inclusion in the listing, this may of course also indicate how demanding or how tough the overall selection process may be. And the Thompson list is one out of them. It may also depend on your academic institution, on your university, which kind of listing they refer to when they make, I don't know, promotion decision or selection decision. So you should keep this, of course, in mind. This is some strategic consideration that unfortunately we also have sometimes to do as researcher.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a question, I think it was asked earlier also by Mr. Nishant. Now, Ms. Shikha Menani has posted the same question, that if our paper is rejected, should we revise the paper based on comments and submit it to the same journal again, or send it to some other journal?
So I will deal with how to react to the feedback in a second. But to this specific question, so if the paper is rejected by the journal, then you are not supposed to resubmit it.
Okay.
Because reject means reject. So only if the editor invites you or has some still open door that it's, so we also have at some journals, not at CGIAR, but at some other journals, they have the decision of reject and resubmit. So the paper is rejected, but then you are explicitly invited to resubmit a new manuscript. And then usually they assign a new handling editor and also a new set of reviewers. So in this case, the editor-in-chief will something he likes of the paper. Yeah, so there is some glimmer of hope, but he also agrees that with this evaluation and with this set of evaluators, there's no chance to survive. And then they have this reject and resubmit. But if you receive a rejection letter and it's a rejection letter, then it's a rejection. So then you cannot resubmit to the same journal. You cannot resubmit. Of course, you can submit a new manuscript, right? So that has to be significantly different from the manuscript that has been rejected. So different theory, different data, different research question. It may be related, of course, in the same research subject, in the same area, but it has to be a sufficiently different, a sufficiently new manuscript. This you could then submit, but this would not be a resubmission, but would be a submission of a new manuscript.
New manuscript, yeah. Okay. I think that's it for now, sir. We can move forth
Okay.
and then take up other questions.
Okay, so I shared with you the reviewer guidelines of CGIAR. The criteria that are used are always a bit different. I have already mentioned that. There is a nice paper also by Gerardo Patriota in the Journal of Management Studies. So he refers to 5 criteria: motivation of the paper, conceptual clarity, methods, findings, and contribution. And I will not, in the interest of time, delve into this, but just strongly recommend you also this article, because what Patriota does, and you also find it on the slides, but as I said, in the interest of time, because you also had frequently asked how to deal with the feedback, so I want to have sufficient time also for this subject. But in this article, Patriota very aptly, with regard to these 5 criteria, summarizes, based also on his experiences as an editor, what are frequently concerns with regard to motivation, clarity, methods, findings, and contribution. What are potential concerns that are frequently raised in the review process? And he makes suggestions. What can authors do in advance in order to avoid that such concerns come up? Okay, so, and he aptly explains this, and I think it's a very illuminating article that you may also want to read and to consult and to see what are what is his summary of potential concerns and suggestions how to overcome them in advance with regard to the motivation, the conceptual clarity of a paper, the employed methods, the findings, and the contribution of the paper. Okay. So now let's ask the question that some of you have already brought up before. So how to deal now with the feedback that we receive from the evaluation of our manuscript. So what is important here? It's important to read all the comments very carefully, and when you read them, be open to suggestions. So read them in a mode of being open-minded and not in a mode of knowing everything better in advance, because you spend so much time and so much effort on this research. So it's really important to be here open-minded, to be open to suggestions, and to very, very carefully read all the comments. It may also help to, of course, read them several times. So if it's a rejection, of course, we are all, first of all, disappointed and frustrated. Perhaps read the in-depth comments just 1 day, 2 days, or 3 days later to ensure that not your frustration and your disappointment may bias you in perhaps also your evaluation of the suggestions that are provided in this feedback. So the bottom line actually is, this is an opportunity to learn and grow based on this feedback. So we should always try to learn and grow and to use this feedback to become better and really to learn and grow from it. So in case you have the fortunate response received that you are invited to revise and resubmit your manuscript, then this is, particularly in the high impact journals, a really great achievement, a really great achievement. So this is the good news. The bad news is it's a great achievement, but it's just another step in a very, very long journey. So don't feel in any way safe or relieved or even over-optimistic. Yeah, so this is just one step, and the final outcome, the outcome already of the next round of review, is by no means guaranteed. So round after round, you need to convincingly overcome the concerns that are raised in the previous round of review, and several rounds of review may follow. Yeah, so I heard also from colleagues that even in the 6th or 7th round of review, which is of course a very, very disappointing outcome, they have received a rejection. It can happen. It should not happen, but it may happen at some journals. At CGIR, our policy is, and we are not always able to achieve it, but our policy, our intention is to provide, after the second round of review, at least a provisional accept or a final rejection of the manuscript. So after 2 rounds of review and, of course, revision. How to deal with the feedback that you receive in the decision letter by the editor and the referee reports by the reviewers that you also always get for perusal. Check and compare them thoroughly. Yeah? Check and compare all the comments that you have received. Check whether they converge. Check whether they differ from each other. And particularly in the latter case, so if there are different or partly perhaps even conflicting suggestions made by the several reviewers, pay particularly attention to the guidance that you have hopefully received by the handling editor. So you certainly do not to pay attention only to the guidance provided by the handling editor, to the comments provided by the editor, but you should pay particular attention, besides and beyond the comments you received by the reviewers, to the comments that are made, to the summarizing comments and guidance that is provided by the editor. Yeah, you have to deal with all the comments, but if there are conflicting suggestions among the referee reports between the reviewers, then at least a good editor should give you some hints how to deal with these conflicts. So a good editor should not leave you on your own here, but should at least say, well, I would weight perhaps this as more important than this, or you may try to reconcile this either that way or this way. So this is how you have received the comments, the feedback by the reviewers and the editor. And in case you are invited for an R&R, for a revise and resubmit, well, think about and prepare carefully your response, how you want to deal with all the comments received in order to further strengthen your manuscript. Be also honest to yourself. Are you really able to rule out all the concerns or the major concerns raised? What is essentially needed to achieve this? Perhaps new data need to be collected. Perhaps another method need to be employed. You should very, very honestly self-assess whether this is doable for you. The good news here is it should be doable, right? So at least the editor came to the conclusion based on the previous version of your paper and based on the comments by the reviewers that it is worth to invite you to revise and resubmit. So editors do this only if they see sufficient hope that the comments and the concerns can convincingly be overcome. But this may require, again, a lot of work and very, very tough effort. So it may be as much work as writing up a new paper. So that's what you should keep in mind when you think about to revise and resubmit your paper. And now I come to the question that was raised previously by one colleague, didn't note the name. Shall we respond to all comments or just to a selection of comments? So you must, I would even say, revise your manuscript and provide a point-by-point response to all comments. So you cannot make a self-selection of comments that you want to deal with and comments that you want to ignore. Of course, you don't have to follow all the comments, okay? So, but in this case, you have to provide a strong justification, a strong response to the editor and to the reviewers, why you have refrained, for which specific good and compelling reasons you have refrained from seizing this suggestion. So in the revision, you should try to address and overcome all the concerns raised in the prior round of a review. You are the author, of course. You are also in the position to say, I don't accept this suggestion. I don't agree with this comment. But this will require from you to make transparent to the editor and to the reviewer why you come to this conclusion, why you disagree with the reviewer or with the editor. So it's possible, but it will require that you provide a strong justification and a convincing rationale why you have not responded to the, why you have not seized this suggestion. And in your response letter, you should really point by point list, you can have it as a table, list all the comments on the left, in the left column, and list in the right columns how you have dealt with it. You do not have to repeat passages of the manuscript in case you have dealt with it, but just briefly explain how and why you have seized the suggestion and refer to the section in the manuscript where the reviewer and the editor can read this accordingly. And if you don't have, if you have not seized the suggestion, then provide a strong justification, a compelling explanation why you have not done so. So that's how to deal with the received feedback, particularly in the fortunate event. I have to emphasize that you are invited to revise and resubmit. I surmise there will be questions on this.
There are a few questions, but sir, if you feel it to be correct, maybe we can wind up with the presentation and then take up all the questions, because you know I'm feeling that many of the questions do get answered in the PPT only.
No, that's perfectly fine with me. I also have just 2 more slides to share, and then we can use
then we can take up the question answer.
That looks
okay.
very good. So what then, how to deal with the eventual outcome? Yeah? And the eventual outcome logically can only be the eventual outcome. Either the paper is eventually rejected or the paper is eventually accepted. In case the paper is rejected, then of course this outcome is very disappointing, and let me emphasize, it's for everyone disappointing. So all scholars actually have made this experience, and even if you have many publications and have gained much experience, it still remains disappointing to get a rejection letter. And I think even the most high caliber stars in our field, they all have made the experience that some of their work has also been rejected, and that is disappointing. So the important thing is, don't give up. Yeah. So even if you get a rejection letter, you can also say to yourself, well, this is actually what happens in 95% of all the cases of submissions to high impact journals. So you're not alone. So no reason to be demotivated or completely pessimistic. The important thing is, don't give up, remain persistent, and try to strengthen your research agenda based on the feedback that you get. So all the feedback that we receive in our research process should be used in order to learn from it, right? In order to improve our research, in order to become better. So ask yourself, even in case of a rejection, what can be learned from the referee process? And now I'm referring also to a question that was asked before and that we had postponed, a question from one of our participants. So if the paper is rejected, should I simply send it to another journal after the rejection? My strong recommendation is no, don't do that. Yeah, avoid to simply submit the rejected manuscript to some other journal without any reflection of the long review process, without any improvement of the paper. If you simply submit it to the next journal without any improvement, well, this indicates you have nothing learned from the review process. So all the hard work actually that also was invested by the reviewers, by the screening editor, by the handling editor, all these very, very costly work actually led to no improvement. And this is not how you should deal with the feedback that you have received. You should honestly and openly reflect it. And even in the case of disappointing rejection, think about, well, what can I take from here? What can I take from these comments to make my paper better, to strengthen my paper before submission to another journal? So I strongly recommend not simply moving on to the next journal. I recommend, though, because I think it would be the loss of an opportunity to learn and grow. There's also a more practical reason for this recommendation. So if you submit the same paper that has been rejected just to another journal, and remember how reviewers are selected, so they have to have expertise in this specific field, theory and method, the pool of reviewers may be limited. So the chances that you get at least one identical reviewer at the next journal that has already seen your paper in the prior journal, well, this likelihood is significantly higher than zero. And just imagine the perspective of this reviewer who spent, I don't know, 1 day, 2 days reviewing the prior version of the manuscript and seeing the same version after all the work he has invested, the same version again to be reviewed at another journal. I think we all may surmise that these will probably not positively bias the impression that this person may have from this new submission. Well, the other, and of course, much more fortunate, but also much more seldom eventual outcome is that your paper is finally accepted. Well, this is, of course, a very, very great achievement. So high impact journals have a very, very low proportion of accepted articles. So you can really be proud, you can be happy, and you should really also celebrate such an outcome. But besides being happy and being celebrate, you may also think about how to disseminate your article in order to make it, even if it's published in a high impact journal, more visible among colleagues and among your research community, in order to make sure that it reserves the deserved attention and hopefully impact. So you could perhaps email the article to some colleagues where you think they could be particularly interested in this research. Of course, you share it with your network of colleagues in order to also make them aware of this article, and hopefully they will read it. Perhaps they will use it in the classroom. Perhaps in their own research they build on it. They may cite it. Some final thoughts before I conclude. Academic writing and publishing is a form of communication. That's what we always have to keep in mind. It's not only that we have to have good and in-depth knowledge of theory, of methods, that we have to be experts in data collection and data analysis. We also have to be good communicators. We have to communicate all the research or the research that we have done. Communication means that we have to have the big picture always in mind. Otherwise, communication will be lost in details. But at the same time, communication of high impact research also requires to pay a lot of attention all the time for details. Yeah, just think about clarity of terms, consistent use of them. This is what I mean when I talk about details. But at the same time, the big picture, the overall story of the paper has to be always present in the communication. The bottom line is to attract and to convince your readers. As I said, a good story can help in this regard. And so good knowledge of your field of research, theories, methods, and data is indispensable, no doubt. So without it, it will not work, but it's not sufficient. So the communication skill, the writing up skills actually are also important. With regard to writing for academic and high impact journals, with regard to academic writing, we have to remember that writing and publishing is a practice. Craft, and it's a practice. So what is true for practices, whether it's writing, whether it's singing, whether it's running, practices benefit from exercising. Yeah, if we do not exercise, if we do not try, we won't learn this practice. But the more seriously we try, the more seriously we try to practice, the more seriously we exercise, the better we will get. So I wish you good luck and all the best. And you have to try, you have to exercise. It's hard work, it's a hard and long journey, but without trying, without exercising, it will be impossible to reach the end of the journey. So we have to take it step by step. And I wish you good luck and all the best. But first of all, I'm now open for the remaining questions that we have not yet dealt with.
Yeah, I'll take up the questions now, sir. So the first question is by Dr. Pooja. She wants to know that when should we submit the paper to the high impact journals? Should we wait for their call for papers? Will it increase the chances of acceptance, or should we submit it throughout the year?
Yeah. So this is a good question. The question actually is, when are the chances higher of acceptance for a regular issue or for a special issue. And as always or frequently in the academic discourse, the answer is it depends. So it depends. It depends on your research article, and it depends on the scope of the special issue. So if the special issue has a very, very, let's say, narrow, novel scope of area, and if your article is really a good fit for this novel, narrow area of the special issue, then this would be ideal. Yeah? Then it would be good to submit to the special issue, and then this may increase the chances in the sense that for this novel and narrow field, the special issue may attract a lower number of submissions. And this may increase the chances. Whereas when the special issue is on a rather broad theme, perhaps even covering different disciplines and different areas, and it's very likely that they receive a very high number of submissions, it may be less an issue. So it depends. I would personally not, well, if you know there is a special issue on the way, then it may be worth to wait. But if you are not aware of a special issue on the way, I would not wait, right? So then the essential thing is the fit with the scope and mission of the journal and the things that we have mentioned before. And I understand the question, but of course also for the special issues, the overall expectation of the journal from the guest editors of the special issue is not to have higher, but also of course not to have lower expectations or quality criteria than are usually used within the journal. So maybe a good idea if it's a narrow, novel field and your paper fits very, very well, then it could increase the chances, but overall I would not think too much about it. I think the criteria that we have discussed and mentioned today, they have to be met in any case in a sufficient manner.
Right. So thank you. Dr. Neha wants to ask that if we need more clarity about the reviewer comments, how should we approach them?
Mm-hmm. Well, the reviewer comments should hopefully be sufficiently clear. When they are not sufficiently clear, hopefully the editor in his summary and in his comments to the authors hopefully provides clarification. So my recommendation in such a case is I would not approach the editor first. What I would do, I would seek for a friendly comment, so a second eye by a colleague not involved in the process, right? So you discuss with your co-authors, we don't understand this, this is not clear to us. Then I would recommend, well, ask someone in your department or at some other school that you know well. You can easily disclose to this person the review, the manuscript, and also the comments that you have received. And then you ask this person, well, do you understand what is actually meant here? So I would ask for some other opinions. If they also converge on the assessment that this is unclear, then after this additional opinion, then you should ask the editor, and you should ask, again, very polite, as I said, and ideally you may offer perhaps conflicting interpretations that may have left open in the prior comments. So don't simply ask very vaguely, how is comment 5 to be understood? Yeah. But ask, is comment 5 to understood in the way A, or is it to be understood in the way B? or is it to be understood in some other way? Because this makes it easier also for the editor to see where is the source of the misunderstanding, and he may be able to perhaps provide this clarity very quickly and very easily. And so then this could be achieved very efficiently. If you just ask openly, you put unnecessarily much burden of effort on the editor that you may want to avoid.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, sir. Dr. Sakshi wants to know that is paper slicing a good idea, or we should send the whole paper in the good quality journal?
Yeah, paper slicing, if you also call it paper slicing, is not a good idea, because paper slicing actually means that you try to slice an overall research project in as many papers as possible. And this is not a good idea, because we want to have high impact articles in high impact journals. And so do not think in slices, think in what is a high impact piece that can be developed and built from perhaps a broader and a larger research project. If you slice too much, if you slice too early, then there is the risk that there will only be incremental contributions left, and the overlap between the different slices is too large, which may not be appropriate for a high impact journal.
Thank you, sir. I think we are left with just two more questions. One is that by Dr. Beauty. She wants to know that if same reviewer is there in the next journal wherein we are submitting our paper, the revised version of the paper, what are the chances? Will he still reject it, or he may accept it in the next journal, the revised version?
I cannot say, of course, here in general, but there is a chance that he will not reject it again. So if you took the comments, the paper was rejected in Journal 1, but you took the comments seriously, and perhaps you did not follow all of them, but you improved the paper. And then you submitted as a new manuscript to Journal 2. And the same reviewer is randomly assigned also at Journal 2, then the same reviewer will, of course, also, he will remember that he reviewed this before, but perhaps he goes back to his files. And perhaps then not perhaps, certainly then he will also recognize that the paper has improved or is revised. So, and depending on the improvement and the revision that has been done, then the likelihood, of course, is much higher that he will not reject it again. The journal also is a different one, right? So perhaps one concern was the fit with the scope and mission was not so good at Journal 1. Perhaps Journal 2 is a better fit, and so the reviewer is more convinced also in this regard from the new manuscript submitted to Journal 2. So there is no, so you should not fear that the same person will necessarily reject the paper again. One comment I would also like to make, I think it's important also to emphasize this, reviewers at least should, and editors in chief they do, they do not want to reject manuscripts, right? So as an editor, this is not what I want to do. I, of course, want to accept manuscripts. It's not that there is a preference to reject. It's just the responsibility to make sure that specific quality criteria are fulfilled. But also for me as an editor, of course, it's much more delightful to write acceptance letters than rejection letters, because as I also said, everyone in our community has made the experience of getting rejection letters. And we all know this is frustrating and disappointing. So the important thing is really not to give up and to persist, even if we get this rejection feedback. Don't take it as a negative feedback, take it as a constructive feedback and see how to develop your research agenda based on this further.
Right. Next question is from Ms. Shweta. She wants to know that what are the essential aspects that we should keep in mind while preparing a questionnaire-based empirical paper?
The essential things to keep in mind when we develop a questionnaire-based empirical paper. Well, it's a bit what I questioned yesterday. We need a specific workshop then also on methods, perhaps. So this would be then a workshop about survey-based methods.
I think at this point, only on behalf of members, I would request JP Sharma sir that we have already got a topic for the next workshop, and maybe we can discuss with Professor Till whenever sir is free. We must go ahead with that workshop as well.
Yeah, I think a methods workshop, because we also had a question, I don't know, yesterday or today, that also referred to some methods aspects. So, and of course, this question now is even more specific because it applies to one specific method, and this is cannot be dealt with here in 1 or 2 minutes. The important thing also, one of the participants has mentioned in another question, that refer to should we use either self-developed survey measures or established survey measures. So I can just reiterate this comment whenever possible. Use validated, reliable items and measures that have been used in high impact articles before. But if you want to develop or have to develop because of the research question, your own survey instrument, then this is, I think, a subject on its own. We cannot deal with it here.
Last question, sir, for the day. Is it good idea to mention in cover letter that paper has been submitted elsewhere, or it got rejected and the comments have been addressed?
I would not do that. It's a good question. Actually, I haven't thought about it before. It's a very good question. I would not do that because it gives the impression to the editor that his or her journal is not your first choice.
Yeah.
And I would not give this impression without any need. So if it comes, for example, if this reviewer who has already reviewed for Journal 1 before and mentions this in his review report, then this comes up and you can deal with it. But without any need in the cover letter, I would not, personally, I would not do it. What I would do also in the cover letter, this is what I not have mentioned before, if it's not requested in the formal submission guidelines, you could mention that the paper has been accepted for presented and discussed at conference A or conference B. Yeah, that's what you could do. Yeah. So then the editor sees, well, if it's a good conference, the paper has already survived the selection process of this conference. So this adds actually legitimacy to the quality signal of your submission. But without necessity, I would not mention that it has not successfully been submitted to another journal before.
Yeah. I think that's it from the question side, sir. Thank you once again for a wonderful session today as well. And I would now like to invite Dr. Poonam Sethi to present a formal vote of thanks. And before ma'am begins, I would like to inform all the participants that the link for feedback form has already been shared in the chat box. So please fill it up. Thank you. Over to you, ma'am. Poonam, ma'am.
One last word from my side.
Yeah, sure, sir, sure.
Would like to thank you very much again for the invitation to join this workshop, and I would like to thank all the participants. I'd like to thank all the participants for your kind attention and for the good question that you have also submitted. So I enjoyed being here with you very much, and I thank you all for joining the workshop and for your participation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Am I audible?
Ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you once again, Dr. Nidhi, for giving me this opportunity to extend vote of thanks to our honorable resource person, Professor Til Chalaulika, for this grueling session. Professor Till, if I may speak what has occupied my attention for these 2 days, then it is my wishful thinking that this FDP should have been a 3 or a 5 day FDP. But without sounding too greedy, I must admit that these sessions have left us longing for more, and we hope that we will be able to have slice of your valuable time and knowledge at some later date in the calendar, at your convenience, of course. Hope you remember you suggested another FDP for methods and tools. Every participant here has learned valuable techniques which will be helpful in writing academic papers of high quality. Some of the key takeaways of these sessions indicate there are no shortcuts and the journey is arduous and a rigorous one. Terms like link and flow, rigor and relevance have assumed newer dimensions and have underlined the need to maintain them diligently throughout one's study. Some of them are rare to find kind of pearls of scholarly wisdom that we are lucky to have found in this FDP. The way you have taken everyone along with the theme of the FDP has been an immersive experience. These tricks will make a huge difference to the way participants will write papers hereafter. In fact, on a lighter note, a survey to highlight pre-FDP wisdom and post-FDP wisdom may throw some pleasant surprises. Meticulously prepared content, coupled with your experience as the editor of a niche journal, has lent high academic flavor to this FDP. It is indeed my honor and privilege to thank you on behalf of GRFCG fraternity, participants, and on my behalf for sparing your precious time and making this FDP a meaningful one. It would not be out of place to mention here that Professor Till was also a member of our collegium held, of the conference held last September. His association with our foundation is now an established one, and we will continue to nurture it in the coming years as well. Thank you so much, Dr. Till. The foresightedness of the founding chairperson, Professor J.P. Sharma, in bringing GRFCG into existence and now serving as a vehicle of common good is laudable and makes all of us proud to be member of this foundation led by him. The benefits of his hard work, commitment to the cause of collective good, and bringing only the best in the field to his people establishes him as a visionary and leader we are proud to be associated with. We hope the legacy created by him will grow by leaps and bounds, and no words are enough to thank him for his rich contribution to the field of corporate governance. Thank you, sir. Our Board of Governors have been a source of strength and pride for the foundation. Doyens of their respective industries, they bring diversity to our board, making it unique and complete. They always find time to participate in the foundation activities with a lot of enthusiasm. A special thanks to Professor Nikhil Bhushan Dey, Professor S.P. Kala, Dr. Mahajan for sparing their valuable time. Participation of some of the eminent people in the FDP also deserves a special mention. We would like to thank them for sparing their valuable time, especially in the weekend. Naveen Kumarji, whole-time director with PFC, Dr. K. Tara Shankarji, Dr. J. Kiranmai, Dr. Sunaina Kanodia, Dr. Urvashi Sharma, Dr. Amit Singh, thank you for your presence. And finally, to all the participants, a big thank you for making it interactive and meaningful through your questions. Remember to fill up the feedback form. Meanwhile, our journal, Corporate Governance Insight, has been gaining recognition in corporate governance arena. 3 editions are already in circulation and available on our website. Call for papers for 4th edition is also out currently. As a pointer, it is a biannual peer-reviewed journal with the objective of promoting and disseminating new knowledge and research in corporate governance and other allied areas on a global level. The journal seeks to provide a platform for both academia and business community to share research and experiential insights in the area of corporate governance, corporate social responsibility, corporate finance, sustainable business, and other related areas. Our editorial advisory board includes eminent people in the field of academia and practicing professionals, including Professor Till. Thank you once again, Professor Till, for helping us out. No publication fee is charged by GRFCG for publication in the journal, and author guidelines are available at our website. Authors may mail their manuscripts for possible publication in the journal at journal@grfcg.in. And the foundation, last but not the least, the foundation in its commitment to lifelong learning will be back soon with another gem in knowledge sharing series. Till then, stay tuned and goodbye. Thank you, Professor Till, and namaste to everyone.
Thank you, Devi. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Sir, your mic is on mute. JP Sharma sir, sir कुछ बोल रहे हैं, I think. Yeah.
Thank
Yes,
you,
sir.
Professor Till, sparing your valuable time. God bless you.
Thank you, Professor Sharma. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you.
Always happy to support the Global Research Foundation for Corporate Governance. And I hope that also this COVID-19 crisis is soon over, so that we can also have again personal interaction. But
Yeah,
I
we will.
have to admit this virtual format, it worked very, very well. Of course, I did not expect anything different, right? Because India is the IT country, right? It's the IT powerhouse. So that's proven again. So congratulations also on how well this was managed and how smoothly this webinar run. Thanks to all. Thanks also again to Dr. Nidhi.
Thank you so much, sir.
For
My pleasure.
moderating this event, and also thanks to Dr. Sethi again for your very, very kind words. So I very much appreciate that. Thanks to all.
Yeah.